We've all been there. It's 11 p.m. on a Sunday. The house is quiet. You're ready for bed. And then you hear it. Drip, drip, drip. You trace the sound to the bathroom, only to find the floor covered in an inch of murky water. The radiator valve has burst. Panic sets in. What do you do now? Who do you call? If you're a tenant, it's a landlord's problem. But if you own this home, this is your disaster. You start frantically Googling emergency plumber Walsall. You're cold calling numbers from old magnets on the fridge, praying someone picks up. The first 5 say they don't do emergency calls on Sundays. The 6th guy does, but he wants £300 just to show up, plus £100 an hour, plus parts. He won't be there for 3 hours. This is the moment of peak consumer vulnerability. For decades, this wasn't just a bad Sunday evening. It was a structural gap in the entire Western economy. There was a massive, expensive mismatch between the scale of home utility infrastructure, the pipes, the wires, the boilers, and the fractured, localized, reliable network needed to repair it. The world before our story begins was a world where a broken boiler could bankrupt a family. This inefficiency was an open wound. And in the industrial heartlands of 1980s England, one man looked at that wound and saw an opportunity that would change the way millions of people manage their homes and create a multi-billion-pound empire. This is the story of HomeServe. The story starts in Walsall, West Midlands, UK, in the early 1990s. This is an environment defined by practical manual trades, but also the birthplace of many entrepreneurial sparks. It was into this atmosphere that Richard Harpin entered the picture. Harpin wasn't a master plumber, but he was a visionary salesman with a key observation. He saw that local utility companies, the bodies that supplied the water, gas, and electricity, were incredible at delivering the product, but terrible at helping the customer if something went wrong within their home boundary. Crucially, this was pre-privatization, and the concept of utility emergency cover was virtually non-existent. Consumers believed their homeowner's insurance covered everything. They were wrong. Insurance covers the damage, the new floor, but it doesn't cover the repair of the burst pipe itself. Harpin understood that this was a fundamental risk that customers would pay to offload. They didn't want the stress. They wanted a fix-it button. In 1993, a year before the UK gas market was fully liberalized, Harpin began developing a simple idea, an insurance-like product specifically designed for domestic emergencies. This was not originally called HomeServe. The earliest seed of the idea was incubated within South Staffordshire Water, a local water utility. Harpin, needing capital and strategic leverage, convinced the water company's management that this was the future of customer service and additional revenue. The core premise was simple. For a low monthly fee, literally pounds a month, a customer could purchase peace of mind. If their water pipes burst, the utility would send a dedicated, reliable engineer, and the cost was covered. It was a micro-insurance product based not on financial payouts, but on dispatching service. South staffs agreed. They had a captive customer base, all the homes they supplied water to, and Harpin was offering them a way to turn that connection into a powerful new business line. They launched Customer Service Limited as a joint venture, offering the cover initially just to their own water customers in the West Midlands. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Consumers didn't just want it, they were relieved it existed. This was the quiet, localized laboratory where the entire global model for HomeServe was first tested, and it worked perfectly. But the West Midlands was just the laboratory. Richard Harpin's ambition was far bigger. As he looked at the initial metrics, the conversion rates, and the customer retention, he realized that if this worked in Walsall, it could work in London. If it worked in the UK, it could work in the world. But to scale it up, the small, innovative idea would need to break free from the constraints of a single local utility. By 1994, the initial pilot with South Staffordshire Water had proven one thing. People didn't just want emergency cover, they trusted their utility providers to give it to them. Richard Harpin realized a critical psychological truth of the British consumer. While they might ignore a cold call from an unknown insurance firm, they would almost always open an envelope from their water board. This was the birth of the affinity model. Harpin's genius wasn't just in the plumbing, it was in the partnership. Instead of spending millions on a standalone brand, he went to other regional water companies and made them an offer they couldn't refuse. Let us sell our service to your customers using your brand name. We do the work, you take a slice of the profit, and your customers get better service. It was a masterstroke of Trojan Horse marketing. To the customer in London, it looked like Thames Water was offering a new plumbing service. To the customer in the north, it looked like Northumbrian Water. In reality, it was all Richard Harpin's team in a growing office in Walsall. By 1995, the company, then operating as HomeServe within the South Staffordshire Group, was signing deals at a blistering pace. They weren't just a service provider anymore, they were a marketing engine. They mastered the art of the direct mail envelope. They knew exactly which shade of emergency red on a letter would trigger a homeowner to sign up for £5.99 a month. But selling the policies was only half the battle. If you promise a plumber in 2 hours, you'd better have a plumber in 2 hours. As the policy count climbed into the hundreds of thousands, the logistics became a nightmare. Harpin faced a choice: hire thousands of staff plumbers or build a massive network of independent contractors. He chose a hybrid model that became the envy of the industry. HomeServe began vetting local mom-and-pop plumbing businesses, giving them a steady stream of work in exchange for strict adherence to HomeServe's service standards. This allowed the company to scale without the massive overhead of a fleet of thousands of vans, at least initially. The technology of the mid-90s was the silent engine here. Before high-speed internet, HomeServe built a massive centralized call center. This became the brain of the operation. When a pipe burst in Leeds, the call went to Walsall. The operator saw the closest vetted plumber on a screen and dispatched them via radio or pager. It was an early version of the gig economy logistics we see today with Uber or Deliveroo, but decades ahead of its time and applied to the high-stakes world of home maintenance. The efficiency was terrifying to competitors. By the late 90s, HomeServe was no longer a regional experiment. It was a national powerhouse. This period also saw the expansion beyond just water pipes. Harpin realized that if you could cover a pipe, you could cover a boiler. If you could cover a boiler, you could cover the electrics. The home in HomeServe began to mean everything within the 4 walls of the property. They were building a moat around the British home. By the time the millennium approached, HomeServe had millions of policies in force. The cash flow was incredible, predictable, recurring monthly revenue that investors salivate over. The small customer service arm of a local water utility was now significantly more valuable than the water company itself. The stage was set for a massive corporate divorce. The tail was now wagging the dog. It was time for HomeServe to step out from the shadow of South Staffordshire Water and become a public giant in its own right. But as the company grew, so did the stakes, and the complexity of keeping millions of customers happy. By the early 2000s, the financial reality of the South Staffordshire Group was undeniable. You had a traditional, regulated water utility, steady but slow-growing, and then you had HomeServe, a high-growth, high-margin marketing and service machine. To the stock market, they were 2 different species. In 2004, the divorce became official. HomeServe demerged from South Staffordshire Water and listed on the London Stock Exchange as a standalone entity. Richard Harpin, the man who started with a vision of a safety net, was now the CEO, of a FTSE 250 company. The listing provided the war chest needed for a decade of pure, unadulterated growth. With the capital from the IPO, HomeServe went on a shopping spree. They weren't just buying competitors, they were buying capability. They acquired specialized repair businesses, smaller insurance books, and most importantly, they started moving into the gas sector in a big way. This was the era of the HomeServe membership. It shifted from being a water pipe company to a everything-in-your-home company. They launched products for internal electrics, external drainage, and boiler breakdown. The goal was simple: total domestic dominance. If you owned a home in the UK, HomeServe wanted to be your invisible protective shield. The real golden goose, however, was the boiler. In the UK, the central heating boiler is the heart of the home, and when it dies in February, it's a national emergency. British Gas had held a near monopoly on boiler service for years with their home care product. Harpin saw them as a slow-moving giant ripe for disruption. HomeServe went to war. They used their proven affinity model to partner with gas suppliers and manufacturers. They offered lower premiums and faster response times. By the mid-2000s, the iconic red HomeServe vans became as common on British streets as the postman. They were no longer just a middleman. They were a massive employer of skilled tradespeople. This was the golden era. Profits were soaring, and the company was expanding its reach into France and Spain, proving that the British peace of mind model was a universal human desire. The share price was a darling of the City of London. But as the company scaled to millions of customers and thousands of engineers, the culture began to shift. The focus on hitting aggressive sales targets, driven by the pressure of being a public company, started to create friction. The sales-first mentality was beginning to outpace the service-first promise that Harpin had originally built. In the race to satisfy shareholders, HomeServe's marketing became increasingly aggressive. Direct mail wasn't just frequent, it was relentless. Telesales scripts became more persuasive. For a while, it didn't matter. The numbers were too good to question. HomeServe was the undisputed king of the home assistance market, and it seemed like nothing could stop the red machine. However, in the shadows of this explosive growth, a storm was brewing. The very regulators who had watched the industry grow were starting to take a closer look at how those millions of policies were being sold. The golden era was about to hit a very expensive brick wall. Success often breeds a certain level of blindness. For HomeServe, the height of their power in 2010 was also the precipice of their greatest crisis. They were about to learn that when you sell peace of mind, the one thing you cannot afford to lose is the customer's trust. By 2011, HomeServe was a juggernaut. It had over 6 million customers in the UK alone. But inside the call centers and the marketing suites, the pressure to maintain the golden era growth was creating a toxic culture. The Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, started receiving a trickle of complaints that soon turned into a flood. The allegations were serious: mis-selling. It was claimed that HomeServe's sales staff were using high-pressure tactics to sell policies to people who didn't need them, or worse, to elderly customers who didn't fully understand what they were buying. The safety net was starting to look like a trap. In October 2011, the unthinkable happened. HomeServe voluntarily suspended all outbound sales calls in the UK. This wasn't just a minor pause, it was a total shutdown of their primary growth engine. The news sent shockwaves through the City of London. In a single day, the company's share price plummeted by 25%. The suspension lasted for months as the company launched an internal investigation. What they found was a systemic failure of tone at the top. The drive for profit had completely decoupled from the duty of care. The FCA's investigation was now in full swing, and it wasn't just looking at scripts. It was looking at the very heart of how HomeServe functioned. For 3 years, the cloud of the FCA investigation hung over Walsall like a shroud. Richard Harpin, once the hero of the West Midlands, was now facing his greatest trial. He had to decide whether to fight or to transform. To his credit, he chose the latter, but the price of penance was staggering. In February 2014, the FCA handed down its verdict. They fined HomeServe £30.6 million. At the time, the largest fine ever imposed by the FCA on a retail bank or insurance firm for mis-selling. The regulator's report was scathing, stating that HomeServe had lost its way and prioritized profit over fair treatment of customers. But the fine was only part of the cost. HomeServe also had to pay out over £11 million in compensation to customers. More importantly, they lost something that takes decades to build and seconds to break: their reputation. The Trojan Horse strategy was backfiring. Utility partners were nervous about being associated with a brand under such heavy fire. The company had to shrink to survive. They slashed their workforce, overhauled their entire training program, and moved away from the aggressive outbound churn model. It was a humiliating reset for a company that had known only upward trajectories for 20 years. Many analysts predicted this was the end. They thought HomeServe would become a shell of its former self, eventually being broken up or sold for parts. But Richard Harpin wasn't done. He viewed the crisis not as an end, but as a painful, necessary evolution. He realized that if HomeServe was to survive, it had to stop being an insurance sales company and start being a global tech and service company. The UK was a mess, but there was a whole world outside where the HomeServe model hadn't been poisoned yet. It was time to look across the Atlantic. The period between 2011 and 2014 was a baptism by fire. It forced the company to grow up. It moved from being an entrepreneurial Wild West operation to a strictly regulated, professionalized institution. But while the UK was licking its wounds, a new empire was being built in the United States, one that would eventually dwarf the original British business. While the UK was reeling from regulatory fines, Richard Harpin was betting the company's future on a massive gamble: North America. HomeServe had actually entered the U.S. market as early as 2003, but for years it was a small experimental outpost. The American market was a different beast entirely, 10 times the size of the UK, but fragmented into thousands of different municipal water authorities and private utilities. The challenge was cultural. In the UK, people are used to cover. In the US, the rugged individualism of homeownership meant that many people didn't even realize they were responsible for the service line buried under their front lawn. When a pipe burst under the driveway in Ohio, the homeowner was often hit with a $5,000 bill they never saw coming. Harpin applied the Walsall playbook to the States. They didn't try to build a brand from scratch. They went straight to the big utilities. They signed deals with giants like First Energy and later Dominion Energy. But there was a key difference. In the U.S., they found a powerful ally in the form of municipal partnerships. They began partnering with city governments and local water districts. For a mayor, offering HomeServe was a way to protect their constituents from massive, unexpected repair bills without costing the city a dime. It was a political win-win that allowed HomeServe to bypass traditional marketing and go straight to the mailbox of every citizen in a city. By 2015, the U.S. division wasn't just growing, it was exploding. While the UK business was right-sizing and dealing with the aftermath of the FCA fine, the U.S. wing was signing millions of new customers. The American homeowner loved the product. The peace of mind that cost $5 a month to avoid a $5,000 disaster was an easy sell. This was the moment the center of gravity for the entire company shifted. HomeServe USA, headquartered in Norwalk, Connecticut, became the engine of the group. They refined their contractor network using a high-tech dispatch system that made the old Walsall radio pagers look like antiques. The success in America provided the financial air cover for the UK business to recover. It proved to investors that the HomeServe model wasn't broken, it just needed to be executed with better oversight. The US market offered something the UK couldn't: infinite scale. Even with 4 million customers, HomeServe had barely scratched the surface of the 130 million households in North America. They also began to innovate. In the U.S., they launched the HomeServe Cares Foundation, helping low-income homeowners who didn't have coverage and couldn't afford emergency repairs. This wasn't just charity, it was a sophisticated brand-building exercise to ensure they never faced the same predatory reputation issues that had nearly destroyed them in London. By the late 2010, HomeServe was no longer a British company with a U.S. wing. It was a global behemoth where the U.S. was the crown jewel. Richard Harpin's gamble had paid off. He had built a two-engine plane. When the UK engine stalled, the US engine carried the weight until the whole craft could climb to new heights. But as the company became more successful, it caught the eye of the biggest players in global finance. The era of being a plucky, independent public company was about to face its final multi-billion-pound chapter. By 2017, the subscription model was king, but the way people found help was changing. The millennial homeowner wasn't waiting for a letter in the mail, they were opening an app. Richard Harpin saw a divide in his own business. HomeServe was great at helping the 8 million people who had a policy, but they were invisible to the 20 million people who didn't. When a non-member had a leak, they went to Google. Harpin realized that to own the entire market, he needed to own the on-demand space, the place where people go when they haven't planned ahead. He didn't just want to sell the safety net, he wanted to own the ladder, the hammer, and the person holding them. This led to the boldest acquisition in the company's history. In 2017, HomeServe bought Checkatrade, the UK's leading online directory for vetted tradespeople. It was a massive departure. Checkatrade wasn't an insurance business, it was a platform business. It made money by charging plumbers, builders, and electricians a fee to be listed and vetted on their site. Suddenly, HomeServe wasn't just a service company, they were a tech-enabled marketplace. They now had a way to capture the emergency customer who hadn't bought a policy. If you didn't have HomeServe cover, you'd likely end up on Checkatrade, meaning HomeServe won either way. But merging a 25-year-old insurance culture with a fast-moving tech platform wasn't easy. Checkatrade brought with it a different set of headaches: the review economy. Maintaining the integrity of thousands of tradespeople's ratings was a full-time war against fraud and low-quality work. HomeServe poured millions into the Checkatrade brand, launching massive TV ad campaigns with the catchy "Check, Check, Checkatrade" jingle. They were trying to build a household name that stood for quality. However, some traditional tradespeople felt the platform was becoming too corporate, while customers occasionally found that a vetted stamp wasn't a 100% guarantee of a perfect job. Simultaneously, the HomeServe Labs division was experimenting with IoT, the Internet of Things. They launched Leaky, a smart water sensor that clips onto a home's mains pipe and alerts the homeowner's phone the second a leak is detected. This was the ultimate evolution of Harpin's vision. Instead of just fixing the disaster, HomeServe was now trying to predict it. If LeakBot detects a drip at 2 p.m., HomeServe can dispatch a plumber before the floor is ruined at 11 p.m. It turned the safety net into a proactive shield. This tech-first approach made HomeServe look less like an old-fashioned utility and more like a modern tech giant. By 2019, the strategy seemed to be working perfectly. The group's valuation was hitting all-time highs. They were operating in the UK, US, France, Spain, and even making inroads into Japan. They had successfully navigated the regulatory crisis of 2014 and emerged as a diversified, global, tech-savvy powerhouse. But as the world stood on the brink of the 2020 pandemic, the ultimate test was coming. Could a business built on sending strangers into people's homes survive a world where everyone was terrified of contact? And more importantly, would the surging value of the company finally make it too tempting for a big fish to swallow whole? The digital pivot had prepared them for the future, but it also made them the most attractive target in the service sector. The Walsall Plumber was about to meet the global giants of private equity. In March 2020, as nations issued stay-at-home orders, a collective shiver went through the service industry. For HomeServe, the business model relied entirely on physical proximity, engineers in vans, sitting in living rooms, fixing boilers. Initially, there was fear. Would the workforce be sidelined? Would customers stop paying for a service they were afraid to use? But the opposite happened. The home in HomeServe suddenly became an office, a school, and a sanctuary. If your boiler broke in 2019, it was an inconvenience. If it broke in 2020, while you were homeschooling 3 children and trying to run a Zoom meeting, it was a catastrophe. HomeServe was designated an essential service. The company adapted with lightning speed. They pioneered contactless repairs. Engineers would call ahead, customers would move to a different room, and the work would be done in a sanitized bubble. This operational agility didn't just maintain the business, it supercharged it. While other sectors were collapsing, HomeServe's retention rates hit record highs. People realized they couldn't afford to take risks with their domestic infrastructure. The peace of mind product was no longer a luxury, it was a survival utility. By the end of 2020, HomeServe wasn't just surviving, it was reporting record-breaking customer satisfaction and steady profits. As the world began to emerge from the lockdowns in 2021, HomeServe found itself in an incredibly strong position. The U.S. business had reached a milestone of 4.8 million customers, and the North American division was now contributing the lion's share of the group's profit. Richard Harpin's 2-engine plane was now flying at a higher altitude than ever before. The stock market took notice. In a post-pandemic world, investors were looking for resilient infrastructure. They wanted businesses that could withstand a global shutdown. HomeServe, with its recurring monthly subscription revenue and its essential service status, was the perfect candidate. The share price began to climb back toward its pre-pandemic peaks. This was the final peak. The company was firing on all cylinders. Checkatrade was seeing a massive home improvement boom as people spent their lockdown savings on renovating their houses. The HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, business in the U.S. was expanding through aggressive acquisitions of local plumbing and heating companies. HomeServe had successfully transitioned from a 1990s mailing list business into a 2020s global platform. It had survived a regulatory near-death experience, a messy digital pivot, and a global pandemic. Richard Harpin, still at the helm nearly 30 years after starting in Walsall, had built something that looked invincible. But in the world of high finance, invincible is just another word for attractive target. The very resilience that made HomeServe a hero of the pandemic also made it the ultimate prize for the world's biggest asset managers. The Walsall Plumber had grown so large that it was finally time for the sharks to circle. By early 2022, the financial landscape was shifting. Inflation was creeping up, and the easy money era of the pandemic was ending. Investors were fleeing risky tech stocks and looking for real assets, businesses with physical infrastructure, long-term contracts, and a captive customer base. HomeServe sat right in the crosshairs of this trend. In March 2022, the first rumors hit the Financial Times. A mystery suitor was circling. The markets reacted instantly, and the share price, which had been sideways for months, began to twitch upward. The mystery didn't last long. The suitor was Brookfield Asset Management, a Canadian titan with over $700 billion under management. They weren't looking to partner, they were looking to own. Brookfield is a value investor on a galactic scale. They love utilities, pipelines, and property. To them, HomeServe wasn't just a repair company, it was a subscription platform for the home. They saw what Richard Harpin had built, a massive network of millions of households paying a monthly fee. And they realized it was a cash flow machine that would perform even better away from the quarterly scrutiny of the public stock market. For Richard Harpin, this was the ultimate validation. He had started with a £50,000 investment from a water company, and now one of the largest investment firms on the planet was knocking on his door with a multi-billion-pound checkbook. But a takeover is never simple. It's a chess match of valuations, ego, and the future of thousands of employees. In May 2022, the hammer fell. HomeServe announced it had reached an agreement to be acquired by Brookfield for a staggering £4.1 billion, $5 billion. It was a 38% premium over the company's trading price. For the shareholders, it was a payday they couldn't refuse. For the City of London, it was another jewel in the crown of the FTSE 250 being taken private by foreign capital. Richard Harpin, who still owned a significant 7.4% stake in the company he founded, was set to walk away with approximately £300 million. The Walsall Plumber had officially become one of the wealthiest entrepreneurs in British history. But the deal wasn't just about the money. It was about the end of an era. HomeServe was leaving the public stage after 18 years. The transition to private ownership meant that HomeServe would no longer have to report its profits every 6 months. It could hide from the prying eyes of regulators and competitors. Brookfield's plan was clear. Use their massive capital to accelerate the U.S. expansion and turn Checkatrade into a global standard. However, for the employees in Walsall and the engineers on the road, the news was bittersweet. They were no longer part of a British success story listed on the London Stock Exchange. They were now a small cog in a global Canadian machine. The culture that Harpin had carefully rebuilt after the 2014 crisis was about to face its biggest test: integration into a private equity mindset. By early 2023, the deal was finalized, and HomeServe delisted from the London Stock Exchange. The ticker HSV vanished from the screens. The journey from a small office in the West Midlands to a $5 billion global exit was complete. Richard Harpin had done the impossible. He had scaled a unsexy trade into a high-tech empire. But as the dust settled on the sale, one question remained. What happens to a company when the founder's face is no longer the one on the brochure? And what does the HomeServe story tell us about the future of our homes? The sale wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of HomeServe's life as a silent giant. But to understand where they are going, we have to look at the legacy they left behind in the UK business world and the lessons learned from the repair revolution. Every great business story is, at its heart, a story about a person who saw a gap that others ignored. For Richard Harpin, that gap was the terrified homeowner. Before HomeServe, the relationship between a homeowner and a tradesperson was often one of mutual suspicion and high anxiety. Harpin didn't just sell insurance, he sold a button. He sold the idea that a professional vetted expert was only a phone call away, no matter the hour. His legacy is the institutionalization of the handyman. By bringing the fragmented world of local plumbers and electricians under a single corporate banner, he raised the standard of service for millions. He proved that you could apply the same franchise level of consistency to a leaky pipe as McDonald's applies to a cheeseburger. But the legacy is also a cautionary tale. The 2014 regulatory crisis remains a permanent asterisk next to the company's name. It serves as a reminder of what happens when a sales culture eclipses a service culture. The lesson Harpin learned and later preached was that in a subscription business, the initial sale is almost irrelevant compared to the long-term trust. If you sell a policy but fail to fix the boiler, you haven't just lost a customer, you've poisoned the brand. The HomeServe turnaround between 2014 and 2018 is now studied in business schools as a masterclass in how to rebuild a corporate soul. Harpin's willingness to own the failure and radically pivot saved the company from certain death. What can entrepreneurs learn from the HomeServe story? First, the power of the affinity model. You don't always have to build the front door. Sometimes it's better to partner with the person who already has the keys. By leveraging the trust of water and gas companies, HomeServe scaled at a speed that would have been impossible through traditional advertising alone. Second, the importance of geographic hedging. When the UK market became saturated and regulated, the US market provided the growth. When the US market was still maturing, the European markets provided stability. Harpin built a business that was physically spread across the globe, making it nearly impossible for any single local economic downturn to sink the ship. Finally, there is the lesson of the digital leap. HomeServe could have easily stayed a direct mail business and slowly died as its customer base aged. Instead, they bought Checkatrade, invested in IoT like Leaky, and embraced the platform economy. They moved from being a company that fixes things to a company that manages the home. Richard Harpin stepped down as CEO following the Brookfield sale, but his influence remains in every red van you see on the road. He turned a grudge purchase, paying for a plumber, into a blue-chip asset. He proved that even in the age of Silicon Valley and AI, there is still a multi-billion-pound fortune to be made in the pipes under our feet and the boilers in our cupboards. The story of HomeServe is the story of the modern home, a complex machine that we all rely on, but few of us understand. In the gap between our reliance and our ignorance, Richard Harpin built an empire. And while the company is now in private hands, its impact on how we live and how we handle the drip, drip, drip at 11 p.m. is permanent. From a small plumber's idea in the West Midlands to a £5 billion exit, that is the story of HomeServe. When a company goes private for $5 billion, the world usually stops hearing about it. No more quarterly earnings calls, no more public drama. But inside HomeServe's offices in Walsall and Connecticut, the mission didn't stop, it shifted. Under Brookfield's wing, the Walsall Plumber is being retooled for a world that looks very different from the one Richard Harpin started in back in 1993. The immediate focus has been synergy. Brookfield owns a massive portfolio of renewable energy assets, wind farms, solar arrays, and hydroelectric plants. They didn't just buy HomeServe for its plumbing policies. They bought it because HomeServe is the last mile. They are the people who actually get inside the house. In the 90s, HomeServe was about water pipes. In the 2000s, it was about gas boilers. In the 2020s and 30s, the green frontier is the new battleground. As the UK and US move away from gas heating, millions of homes need to transition to heat pumps, electric vehicle chargers, and solar battery storage. This is a massive technical challenge for the average homeowner. Who do you trust to install a 10,000-pound heat pump? Brookfield realized that HomeServe already has the trust, the vans, and the thousands of trained engineers. They are transforming HomeServe from a repair company into an energy transition company. Richard Harpin didn't just vanish into a quiet retirement. Since the sale, he has doubled down on his role as a champion for British entrepreneurship. His story, starting a business with a small investment from a utility and selling it for billions, is the North Star for founders in the North and Midlands of England. He proves that you don't need to be in London or Silicon Valley to build a global unicorn. You just need to find a universal human problem, like a broken toilet or a cold house, and solve it with more efficiency and better branding than the guy down the street. The Walsall model of partnership, persistence, and pivot is his lasting contribution to the business world. Today, HomeServe remains a giant, though a quieter one. Checkatrade continues to dominate the UK trades directory market, and the US division continues to sign up American cities at a record pace. The company has survived scandals, recessions, and global shifts in technology. As we look back at the 30-year journey from that first leaky pipe in Walsall to a £5 billion global exit, the lesson is clear. Peace of mind is the most valuable product you can sell. In an increasingly complex and fragile world, the person who can show up at 11 p.m. on a Sunday and say, "I'll handle this," is always going to be the winner. The story of HomeServe is more than just a business case. It's a story of how we live. It's about the infrastructure we take for granted until it fails, and the empire built on the promise that when it does, you won't be alone. Thanks for watching the rise, the fall, and the ultimate payout of the world's most successful plumbing story. We'll see you in the next one.